So some of you may remember this drawing that we did, or I did a few episodes back of this lighthouse in A4. Now I did say at the time I want you to do a slightly smaller version in A5 on some different paper. So that's what you can see here. Now obviously we'll have another look at those again at the end so we can compare and contrast and see how those look together. So with this piece I'm just going straight in with the fountain pen. One of the reasons why I really do love working quite small sometimes is that the line work it becomes really chunky. Obviously, if you're doing a big piece on a massive piece of A0 paper, the fountain pen lines don't look as bold as they do if you're if you're using this, which is a little 7x5 pad. This is Fabriano watercolour paper, as you can see from the branding below. It's I think 300 GSM. I can't quite see because my finger's over the number, but it's really nice paper. It's quite uniform in terms of its texture, which is not always great. I quite like a bit of a random texture, but as far as watercolor application goes, it takes paint very well, and it's decent quality. So for the initial line work here, what I'm doing is I'm just, again, choosing an area and saying, well, this is a zone of grass here. And as you can see, I'm trying to make sure that every line that I put in is denoting texture and trying to tell its story a little bit. So one of the things about working without the pencil lines underneath is there is a little bit more of a risk of making a mistake. But I think there's a mindset that comes with working straight with fountain pens, straight in with pen, and that is you just roll with what you've got. And if you do something where you think, it doesn't look so good, you just carry on. And actually, to a certain extent, it teaches you to be less fussy, be less self-critical, but also I think in a way, it really teaches you how to roll with the punches. And if you do something where you think, oh, that's not so great, it teaches you how to fix it, or not necessarily fix it, but fudge it. So I think even if you're not necessarily comfortable with going in and just with fountain pen or with a fine liner, with a permanent marker and sketching that way, if you want to do pencil first, I would say try it. Doesn't have to be an expensive watercolor paper. You could get some really cheap print paper and just get used to sketching straight down with fountain pen. One of my favorite little sketching exercises is to sit in my house and just sketch whatever on the table, whether it's a cup or like some books or some of the kids' toys. I'm always drawing kids' toys because they're always such fun shapes, particularly my boy's cars with his big trucks and but yeah, I think there's definitely a lot to be said for expressing and celebrating your own style. And I think that when I draw with pen, the drawings look a lot more like my style in a way. Whereas if I get a little bit obsessed with the pencil work and then the line work and then that, it can become a bit fiddly. And it's nice, you get some really accurate results, but it doesn't necessarily look as expressive and as distinctly my work. See, you can see proportionally here, this lighthouse is not that accurately drawn in, and the lines are a bit wonky and all that sort of stuff. But I don't think it matters personally. Feel free to tell me if you don't, if it bothers you, I think one of the things that attracted me to this image in the first place was this contrast between that wonderful blue grey slate sky and that red of the lighthouse. I think from a colour palette point of view, it's a really interesting one. So this pen that I'm using here is an Opus 88 fountain pen. They are not cheap. This is a Demonstrator, so it's an eyedropper pen, and what that means is that it doesn't have cartridges, or it doesn't have an inner sort of cartridge that you fill with ink. The whole pen is actually a cartridge. So when you undo the middle of the pen and you split it, the whole body of the pen is actually full of ink. And one of the benefits of that is that it's got a huge reservoir, so you can go for a long time without having to fill it up. One of the disadvantages with eyedropper pens is that because they're full of ink, when you use them, you can actually heat up the ink in the pen, and they can burp, so they will drop. A lot of ink will come out the nib. Now, because you've got a lot of ink in it, you really wouldn't want all of that ink coming out in a bag or something like that. So how these Opus 88s and other pens as well get around this is the top of the pen. The opposite end to the nib, you'll see there is a section that you can screw up or down, and that will act as a valve. And that valve will stop it spilling when it's in your bag, or it also stops it burping when you're using it. One of the clever things about it as well is you can actually use that valve to control ink flow to a certain extent as well. So when you shut that valve down, it vacuum locks the whole pen. So eventually it will sort of run out of ink essentially until you open that valve up again. And that you can actually use that feature if the pen is a little bit too wet and you want a slightly drier nib. But yeah, the Opus 88, this is an extra fine nib. It's quick and it's pretty thick. It's a cracking pen. It's been one of my favourite pens for a while now. So here, before I start to put the paint in, what I'm using a food pen, FUDE, and it's basically to create some more ununiform lines. These have got a bent nib, and what they will give you is a very, very thick line width. I could have done this afterwards, and actually a lot of the time I will, is what I'll do is I'll paint it and I'll see how it looks. And then if I think it needs this, I will go in and do it afterwards. But I think here what I've done is, because I'm working small and I want to really try and show you how using big lines, using thick lines when you're working quite small gives you quite dramatic results. I think I'm sort of doubling down on that in my head, and I'm just going, right, let's go in with the thick lines from the beginning. I mean, you can see even here without any ink on, it's quite dramatic. You can go really big and bold, particularly when you're working small, and I think it's great. I love it. It's got a very sort of architectural almost feel about it. It's quite graphical. There's that term illustrative, which can be used as a sort of derogatory term, I think, in terms of art. Personally, I love illustration. I would take a Quentin Blake over a Rembrandt any day, but that's just me. I'm not saying there's a value in that. I love illustration. Some of my kids' books, some of the illustrations in them are just gorgeous. Yeah. So I might just fast forward on now to the to where we're going to start painting. So there's some interesting little painting things happening with this one. I mean, this is 7x5. The original one that I showed you at the top of the tutorial was a 4. But one of the other main differences with this one and the previous one is the other one was done with cartridge paper, so thick, non-specific sort of watercolour, not necessarily watercolour paper, whereas this is Fabriano 300 GSM watercolour paper. And this is 100% cotton, and this will take pigment very well. So as you can see here, what I'm doing is I'm vaguely trying to replicate what is in the reference drawing. You can see I'm dabbing in, I'm not taking a single colour, I'm dabbing in blue and I'm dabbing in grey, and I'm not necessarily trying to get a flat colour wash that we have in the sky there. I'm trying to add some detail. Now, to get that sort of wispy look, I'm using a thin brush. This is a really old, wonky giant rigger thing that I've had for years, and I'm just trying to pull some of those details down. As you can see from the original drawing, the original reference picture, sorry, that it isn't necessarily white in the middle, but I want to try and keep a bit of contrast in the sky. I'm trying to add a little bit there. So I think it's very easy with the sky to overwork it, and you have to remember that when it dries, it will be a lot paler. So sometimes I think with skies, yeah, definitely less is more. We're going to go on to the red now. So just removing that. Okay, so that's been hair dried, and you can see definitely it's a lot more subtle color wise than it was when it was wet. So you do lose a little bit of that pigmentation. So this is going to be one of those drawings where, very much like the other one, where I look at the sky and then I look at the red and I think I should have just left it like that. It's really nice, that kind of contrast between those two elements. But yeah, I keep going. It's one of the nice things about filming your work or like photographing at every stage, is it gives you the benefit to look back and go, which one, did I prefer? Did I prefer it then or then? So as you can see from this paper, it lays down a lovely flat quality. It's really nice. These pads are not bad value, actually, particularly if you buy them as a big block. Okay, so really here, in terms of sort of selective colouring, you could just leave it like that, or you could do a little bit of the road to sort of lead the eye into the image. I'm adding just a tiny bit more pigment in here. I want that to pop a little bit more. What do you think? Should we leave it there? It'd be nice, wouldn't it? It'd make my life a lot easier if I just had to put two colours on all my pictures. Okay, so what you can see here is I've basically got a sheet of paper and done a few little colour samples on there, and that's just to give me a bit of a vague idea about what I'm doing. So I'm using a really muted green here. This is a lot of there's a lot of blue in there, and I'm sketching in some of these shadows. So with this version, I'm going the other way around, which is something I don't always do when I start with the darker tones, and then I will build up to the more light tones, and then that will enable me to decide how much flat detail I put in, whether I leave it as a sort of semi-abstract colour scheme, whether ultimately I end up painting a lot of it. It's interesting, again, I would have to say here that, as it is a really nice image. I would have, weirdly, I could almost just leave that there. Okay, so it looks like I'm mixing some of the road colour in here. As you can see, I'm getting some of the Van Dyke brown, and I'm trying to get some of the palette goo, some of the random palette stuff off there. So I've used a really big brush there. Now, I don't think that was quite right, and I think the reason why I've kind of stopped and had a bit of a think about this is because I'm looking at that and I'm like, I don't really like it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a smaller brush, and I'm going to try and reduce some of that detail down so it's not quite as distracting. I'm obviously keeping some of those white spaces because it's nice to break it up. But then to add a bit more texture, I'm adding in a bit of clean water here. I'm just splashing it in. Now you can see the effect. It's a really interesting effect. Is what it does is it creates these blooms. I'm adding a little bit as we get further back, a little bit. And then while I've got the grey here, adding some shadows, and also adding in some some of the window details. It amazes me sometimes when I think about the order that I actually do some of these sketches in. A lot of the time, there isn't too much of a strict plan, if you know what I mean. It's just I paint until I think I've done enough. And often it can be I end up painting the whole scene. Other times I'll end up stopping. And quite often it's interesting how the more I watch my videos, the more I will see that there's several times I could have stopped and it would have worked as an image. You don't have to paint the whole scene. There may be a point where naturally it just sits well together as a kind of colour palette at several points during the creation of that little piece. Okay, so this has just got back from being hair dried. So this is and what I haven't shown here is actually I didn't record is the sort of yellow down the sides of the road that I've added in. And what I've decided to do is just to go for it and actually fill in this detail in the bottom of the picture. So this is very much a sort of natural sienna. This is a organic sort of light brown, darkish yellow. And I often use this as a tone, as a sort of base tone when I'm doing, watercolor painting. But what I'm doing is I'm putting this in over the top of the darker bits. So one of the interesting things about doing partial colouring is the human eye will tend to fill in areas where there isn't colour. So if you look at both sides of the road here, we have one with the white and one without the white, and you don't actually have to. You can leave the plain white. The human eye will fill that in and choose for it to be grass or whatever. Yeah, it's quite interesting, really, how the variety of tones that your mind will create, if you know what I mean. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to just break up some of this, the more flat feel of the grass and the dunes, adding a bit more variation, try and get back a little bit more of the contrast that I had really before I painted it. Okay, so the final touches really for this piece was to reinstate some of the white. Oh, excuse me. So the final touches in this piece was to reinstate some of the sort of white details, if you know what I mean. So that's just adding in a bit of texture for grass and things like that, adding in the white back for those posts. Yeah, a few dots of white just help break it up a little bit, and I've obviously put tried to put some of the white lines in the road. They're quite faded in the reference picture, but I'm not sure how that road's worked in terms of dabbing in that water. You see, you have all those blobs and blooms in the road. Don't really think it's worked that well. It doesn't feel like it's on the right plane somehow, but it was fun to do. I like it stylistically. It kind of mirrors the sky in a way. So I hope you enjoyed that. Let's have a look at a comparison between the two versions at the end. Yeah, I'm just going to do these final touches. I think what I'm doing here is just adding some horizontal lines in along the road just to try and tell the story that, I'm fiddling is what I'm doing. Definitely fiddling. So anyway, I'll put my signature on it. Anyway, so let's have a look and see those two versions side by side, and we can... Okay, I'm going to just... Okay, so here we can see those two versions, and we can see how they, contrast with each other, really. Obviously, they are different drawings, and the proportions are very different, and they've got very different feels to them. But the one on the left is the one, is obviously the smaller one, the 7x5. It's not A4, so it's kind of half the size of that one. On the right, the line thickness is a lot more exaggerated in the smaller the piece, because the line thickness doesn't change if you're using the same pen. The paint for the sky has worked a lot better, I think, on the one on the left, whereas the one on the right you've got a lot more blooms, and that's down to the nature of the paper. That said, there is some more blooms in the road, but that was intentionally put in, whereas the sky on the right, I didn't necessarily intend for it to look as sort of spidery like that. I mean, it's quite a cool effect, but it's not really what I was after. But that's cartridge paper compared to watercolour paper. So yeah, I mean, it's just an interesting to compare and contrast there, isn't it? Two versions of the same picture. Some elements on the one on the right hand side I really like, such as the darker colours, I think, and the reds, and the foliage in a way is actually more successful in that one. The one on the left, I prefer the line work. Anyway, let us know what you think. So I hope you found that useful, and yeah, we'll see you again next time. And if you're finding these of any use, please do comment. I love getting comments on these. Like and subscribe and all that jazz. And there's a lot of stuff in the description below if you want links to my website, or you want to buy an original piece, or you want to give me some ideas about what tutorials to do, or whatever. Just let me know. Let's get chatting. Cheers, guys. I'll see you again. Bye bye.